This presentation is on some work we did. That was the knowledge synthesis regarding the influence of forest management strategies on ungulate populations and predator movements in Western Canada. So the two ungulates we'll be focusing on today, the first of which is woodland caribou. And woodland caribou in Canada are listed as threatened under the Species at Risk Act. Caribou depend on large, contiguous expanses of habitat to meet their biological needs. Anthropogenic habitat alteration and habitat loss is the primary threat to woodland caribou. And caribou habitat often overlaps with high-value timber. So we'll be looking at how forest management strategies specific to woodland caribou are impacting the landscape and what that might mean for some other species. So there are 19 caribou herds in Alberta, comprised of the boreal and southern mountain caribou ecotypes. There are 55 in British Columbia of boreal, northern mountain, and southern mountain ecotypes. You can see that they're fairly widely distributed, especially across British Columbia. The other ungulate we'll be talking about is moose. Now, moose occupy a wide variety of ecozones from temperate rainforest, boreal forest, montane regions, and native grasslands. They utilize a variety of deciduous browse. They require thermal refugia and cover from predators. North American moose populations are generally in decline, and moose and caribou have a considerable area of occupancy overlap, which their overlap increases as anthropogenic disturbance increases. So we'll move into the caribou recovery actions at the federal level. These are recovery actions that are specific to forest management planning and intended to benefit caribou populations. So in 2012, the Federal Woodland Caribou Recovery Strategy came out, and in that document, it's listed that there is a 65% undisturbed habitat threshold at which caribou have a particular likelihood of becoming self-sustainable, caribou populations, that is. What constitutes disturbed habitat is any anthropogenic feature, and the area within a 500-meter buffer around that feature is considered disturbed, as well as wildfire without a buffer if it is under 40 years old. The general strategies are in the federal recovery strategy are to maintain habitat connectivity, protect key areas through legislated protection, establishment of a zonation approach that includes no development zones, mixed use zones, and conservation agreements. So following the 2012 recovery strategy under the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement, there are a couple of reports published in 2014 and 15 that provide a little bit more detail. One of which is the strategic sequencing of timber harvest. They also include forestry deferral zones, aggregated harvest, and integrated access management across industries and recreation. So we will get into a little bit more of those topics now when we discuss the Alberta-specific caribou recovery actions. So in 2017, the province released the draft provincial range plan. And in this plan, they stated that aggregated harvest is defined as localizing the location, extent, and timing of harvest activities to create larger patches of intact caribou habitat. They also mention they further the idea of access management being integral. Following that, in 2022, the Cold Lake and Bishto Lake sub-regional plans were released. In these reports, in these plans, there's a formal title of a harvest timing series. So we've gone from a concept of aggregated harvest to an actual strategy with a title and some details. There's also additional information and detail around the restoration of forestry activity. And then just earlier this year in 2025, the draft Upper Smoky Subregional Plan was released. And in addition to things like aggregated harvest and access management, the Upper Smoky Plan has details on salvage harvest and fire breaks. And I'll get into a couple of those in a slide or two. But first, let's talk about aggregated harvest. So the slide on the image on the left is what harvest operations would look like kind of in a more, I suppose you could say, typical setting outside of a caribou range, perhaps, where stands would be selected here and there based on a timber supply analysis, and the stand would be harvested pretty close to the ideal age. But as you can see, these features are buffered by 500 meters. And so the image on the right showcases what the aggregated harvest approach ultimately generates in terms of buffered disturbance. There's quite a bit less in this on the landscape. There's less fragmentation, and outside of the harvest areas, the area of caribou habitat is much more contiguous, and they have larger expanses of undisturbed habitat, which is something that I mentioned at the beginning of that is a caribou habitat requirement. This is a hypothetical example of a harvest timing series. You can see all those polygons in the various colors would represent harvest blocks. So what a harvest timing series looks like under the Alberta plans is one of these colors represents one harvest timing unit, and one unit would remain open for harvest operations for a 10-year period. And so the operators can go in there for 1 decade, harvest all the merchantable timber above the minimum harvest age, with the exception of pre-existing exclusions and things like retention and hydrology buffers. And once the 10 years has kind of elapsed, there's another 3 years on top of that to complete all reclamation in the open harvest timing unit. Similarly, once the harvest timing unit is closed after its 1 decade has elapsed, it is no longer available for harvest for another 8 to 10 decades. And then those couple details from the Upper Smoky draft plan, what that looks like is that salvage is allowed in an open harvest timing unit, as well as the following harvest timing unit in the sequence. So let's say in the bottom left corner of this image, you can see the two blue polygons above each other in harvest decades 3 and 4. So if a fire were to kind of occur on the boundary of that, salvage operations would be permitted, both in decade 3 and then as well as in decade 4 if you were midway through that 3rd decade. There are a bit of restrictions around and the other detail from the Upper Smoky draft plan is that fire breaks are mentioned in the draft plan with restrictions on area. So they're permitted to be 320 hectares with a maximum of 500 meters in width, and restrictions on basal area retention in the fire break. So what this kind of looks like functionally is, or could potentially look like functionally, is with that 10-year temporal constraint, there's the potential for a higher proportion of trees that are either below the minimum harvest age, or the stands have kind of gone beyond the age of, merchantable timber and they're falling down, and there's lots of downed woody debris or standing snags. So in a typical timber supply analysis, the stands would be harvested close to their ideal age, and with this 10-year window, that would be, optimized as much as it could, but inevitably there would be a portion that is not quite old enough when you're in there for that 10-year window, or a lot of the trees are kind of dying off at the end of the 10-year window. And lastly, with the harvest timing series, it's not that every single polygon within that open unit is harvested. There are still operating ground rules that apply in all these regions. So things like retention and, like I mentioned earlier, hydrology buffers. Another piece in the Alberta plans is some statements around restoration. Reclamation of seismic lines within harvest blocks are mandated, as well as the 500 meters around harvest blocks, and reclamation of temporary roads. Other temporary features such as landings, storage sites, and camps also must be completed within that 10-year window of the harvest timing series. The access management piece of these plans, I've made this illustration here where on the left there is a road network with some features on the landscape that were kind of, put on the landscape over the course of decades, and where there wasn't an access management plan, and roads were made more or less directly to the feature, with like collaboration, because nobody wants to build a expensive road where they don't have to. But with the access management plan, it would look a little bit more like it does on the right panel, where roads are kind of strategically built or maintained on the landscape, such in a way that reduces the total amount of buffered footprint. So this will result in less fragmentation on the landscape and less disturbance due to the buffers of anthropogenic features. So all of those things I've mentioned so far are sort of in government plans, draft plans, working group planning documents, those types of things. But there have been most forest management plans in Alberta that are currently in place, and harvest is taking place according to these plans, were published or around the time of the 2017 draft plan, or before, like slightly around it or before. So there wasn't these planning documents to govern forest management strategies, but the FMA holders put these details in the forest management plans. So there are actions taken for caribou conservation that are not found in some of the draft plans in those documents. Some of those examples are exclusive winter access where possible to limit the amount of limit the impact on things like ground lichen, which are food source for caribou. There are areas of deferrals that exist in areas that are high value to caribou. So those would be harvested way down the road. There's also silvicultural strategies to reduce deciduous browse and thus kind of reduce the apparent competition of that exists from moose and deer and being in the caribou range as a result of this deciduous browse. Another strategy is planning harvest in areas with high levels of pre-existing disturbance, so as to kind of not introduce novel disturbance on the landscape that would result in more buffered disturbance. So if you put the harvest in areas with high levels of pre-existing disturbance, the buffers, they only count once. So you're not including or introducing more disturbance on the landscape. And now I'll move on to some of the recovery actions in British Columbia and their planning documents. So to reiterate what the sort of planning looks like in British Columbia, there are 55 herds between the three ecotypes. Caribou ecotype classifications are functional and defined by variations in distribution, behavior, and habitat use. The policies and recommendations have been organized by ecotype. These policies and recommendations are put forward in land use plans and land resource management plans. And since the ecotypes vary quite a bit, the strategies found in them vary, on a respective level. And the detail between plans even varies quite a bit. So just to drive home the point that there is the planning, climate, I suppose you could call it, in British Columbia is it encompasses a lot. So the next few slides, I'll list some examples of some of the strategies from these land use and land resource management plans. These are just a few examples because, in our short window this afternoon, it's not necessarily prudent to go through all of them in detail. So just a few examples. In the boreal ecotype, there's generally low levels of forest harvest in the caribou ranges just because there's not much merchantable timber there. Nevertheless, in these plans, they list a zonation approach wherein there would be zones that exclude harvest or new road construction and zones that have conditional harvest. There's also listed that aggregated harvest with large openings of 60 to 100 hectares and silviculture that minimizes the impact to caribou habitat. In the northern ecotype, they also cite, many of these plans also cite a zonation approach with zones like modified harvest, wherein partial harvest systems such as group shelterwood, group selection, or various opening sizes would be utilized to maintain terrestrial and arboreal lichen. There are also areas of exclusions and areas that have sort of no restrictions with respect to caribou. Other strategies would be small patch harvesting and high value caribou habitat, clear cutting of pure stands in large aggregates, partial cutting and mixed wood stands, and harvest that mimics the spatial pattern of natural disturbance by incorporating uneven aged stands into the harvest plans and varying harvest patch sizes, shape, and distribution. And these are all done to maintain forest complexity. In the mountain ecotype, the strategies are even more specific to the region. They often cite a zonation approach where there's harvest restricted zones, zones of exclusions, modified harvest to support the maintenance of caribou habitat values, and again, no areas with no restrictions. I also mention 2 uneven aged selection systems where single tree and group selection will be used to replicate the gap dynamics in alpine systems, as opposed to kind of a large aggregate approach. There can be multiple harvest events over a 240-year period with maximum removal not exceeding 33% by volume. Partial harvest systems on slopes or aggregated or harvest blocks up to 40 hectares in size, unless they are aggregated. And volume retention requirements in relation to the cutting cycle. So something like a single tree selection could remove 23 to 34% on a 40 to 75-year cycle. And so these are some of the strategies in the mountain ecotype, and what is specific to a lot of these regions are the benchmarks, these figures that they reference, things like the maximum removal, volume restrictions. So there are a lot more than just this, but what that means for moose, it's kind kind of one of the main questions of this work is, how do these forest management strategies influence moose? Because they are, like I mentioned in the first few slides, they are have a quite different biology than caribou, quite different biological requirements. So I'll mention a bit of that right now. Moose select stands with increasingly dense canopies as temperature increases. They reduce daytime activity and increase nighttime activity when there are high temperatures. And the amount of snow on the landscape drastically increases movement costs. So those first 3 points, drive home the requirement that, or the idea that moose have year-round requirements for cover. Moose distribute proportionately to the available forage on the landscape. So if a moose range would be kind of maybe on the lower end of dietary nutrition, they would kind of expand their range to meet those dietary requirements. Moose also select forage over predator avoidance in highly fragmented landscape, in highly disturbed landscapes. A couple more points. Moose require a mosaic of forest habitats. They frequently use edge habitat. So they really like, or they have needs for riparian areas and mineral sources. And in edge habitats, they seek cover in the mature stands, but make use of the deciduous browse in some of the more early successional areas around the forest edge. Moose habitat selection also varies seasonally by age, sex, and reproductive status. And so, with all those biological facts about moose, it's, I've painted a picture that they are a generalist species and require a lot of different features in their habitat. So it's kind of a segue is to introduce the fact that moose forest management strategies on moose are likely to produce mixed results. So some of the positive impacts of aggregated clear-cut harvest on moose is that they really like harvest blocks 9 to 24 years after harvest. It's lots of preferred deciduous browse that is tall enough that it provides cover from predators, not a direct line of sight. Studies have found very heavy use of these harvest blocks, in fact, more than the surrounding old growth areas. Irregular harvest blocks provide abundant edge habitat and landscape heterogeneity. I mentioned earlier that moose really like that edge habitat. And also the distance from the edge has kind of been found to have no influence on their selection. So they'll go right into the middle of the harvest block, or stick near the edge. Doesn't really seem to have an impact. There are negative impacts, however. Moose avoid the harvest blocks for the first 8 years following harvest. It's no cover, so they would be subject to thermal stress, both in the summer and the wintertime. There's no deciduous browse yet, and they would be visible to predators. There's also some studies suggesting that the negative effects may persist beyond the 8 years following harvest. Regenerating browse in these harvest blocks have been found to be high in secondary compounds such as lignin and lower in digestible proteins. What that means is less palatable and less nutritious browse for the moose. And if we kind of look to the mountain pine beetle outbreaks in British Columbia and the salvage harvest that took place, that is somewhat of a loose analog between aggregated clear-cut strategies, where there would be large areas harvested in a relatively short amount of time. There's lots of roads, lots of activity, and studies in BC have found that there's reduced browse in these harvest blocks. and that moose are constantly making trade-offs between cover and forage, and they avoid areas with high density of roads and harvest blocks. So those details kind of combined led to the conclusion that this was resulting in unhealthy cows, lower pregnancy rates, and lower calf recruitment. Also in areas with lots of harvest blocks and lots of roads and lots of activity, there's reduced habitat connectivity. And in these regions, moose select patches of habitat that have a higher degree of connectivity with nearby patches. So if a highly fragmented landscape, the moose are looking for other habitat patches that they can, maintain their biological needs as they get to the next patch. But they are less likely to move to a nearby patch if there's a high degree of human activity and disturbance in a 1 kilometer radius. Moving on to the partial harvest systems, the positive impacts. So some partial harvest systems, single tree selection, where individual trees will be selected and harvested from a stand. Group selection, involving the periodic removal of groups of mature trees with openings from 0.01 to 0.1 hectares. And irregular shelter wood, where multiple pass harvest would be utilized, and that would maintain continuous growth in the harvest area. So these partial harvest systems are utilized and implemented on a continuum where, one system, implemented to one degree could produce very similar results to a different system implemented to a different degree, such as, an example would be small clear cuts and dense group selection could produce similar results. These results, these systems can result in increased cover and snow interception in the winter. So that's a good, that kind of checks that box for the moose. And they maintain stand complexity through removal of 2 or more entries, removal involving 2 or more entries, and they, these systems result in a multi-cohort stand. The negative impacts of partial harvest systems: the openings may not be sufficient in size to stimulate a surge in deciduous browse. So if there isn't that browse resource available for the moose, it's just kind of a lot of activity and harvest taking place in their, habitat, and it's, without the benefits of the deciduous browse. So partial harvest systems can result in little moose occupancy in the summertime. So all these harvest systems, the influence on the influence of aggregated clear-cut and partial harvest systems are on a gradient for when it comes to how they impact moose. Some findings suggest that these harvest systems have positive results, negative results, or are negligible. And this is, consistent with the biology of moose being a generalist species. They can utilize this area, this feature, go to one area, go to the next. A couple other details found in these plans and planning documents and how they would impact moose. So some silvicultural details, silvicultural treatments that increase productivity benefit moose, things like site prep and fertilization. Herbicide use reduces browse initially, but after 10 years, there doesn't seem to be much of an impact. Heavy thinning promotes moose occupancy, but because of a surge in deciduous browse, but thinning around 30% doesn't, you don't get that surge in deciduous browse, so they don't utilize those areas. Access management and linear features. So moose do utilize roadside salt pools as mineral sources. there's studies suggesting that roads provide access to new areas that they wouldn't normally be accessing, and there can be abundant deciduous browse on these features as well. Moose haven't shown really preferred use of seismic lines, and seismic line restoration doesn't seem to change moose utilization. But moose avoidance of roads does increase with increasing road density, and moose it's suggested that moose potentially move more freely with an access management system. So as access management results in fewer roads, less of a spreading road network, and seismic line restoration, there would be less predation pressure because the predators of moose really utilize linear features with quite lots of efficiency. So that could be one of the potentially benefiting features of an access management system. Moving on to predator-prey dynamics. The linear features, like I mentioned, disproportionately benefit predators. They move very efficiently on linear features. They can cover a far area with less energy, less time. The predator-prey dynamics in this topic that we're discussing are a bottom-up process in which the wolf behaviors in response to primary prey habitat selection and abundance. So wherever the moose are going, whatever habitat they utilize a lot, that's you're going to see the wolf population behave accordingly. In heavily disturbed landscapes, moose select for habitat patches with high connectivity, like I mentioned, and wolves also select these habitat patches, but with a greater preference, with a stronger selection than the moose show. And this is just another way of demonstrating that the wolves are adapting to the changing landscape in response to how the moose are behaving. Let's kind of wrap up some of the key points. Caribou have specific biological needs. They require large contiguous areas of old growth forest, abundant lichen, that lichen, resources in order to maintain caribou populations take a long time to grow, long time to establish. And on the contrary, moose are generalists. They utilize a wide range of resources of different types, old growth versus deciduous browse, cut blocks, and areas that have very dense cover. And aggregated harvest and partial harvest systems have both positive and negative impacts on moose. So in conclusion, caribou conservation strategies may not align with moose needs. Future research should focus on moose habitat selection and utilization in areas where forest harvest is actively taking place according to the regional policy. So whether that's in British Columbia, where they're, in the mountain ecotype, where they're implementing partial harvest systems to a very specific harvest volume restrictions. And observations in future research should include measurements of habitat connectivity relative to moose utilization, because as I mentioned earlier, moose utilize habitat that has a high degree of connectivity in fragmented landscapes. It would also observations should also include moose response to the HTS and partial harvest approaches in space and time. So see how the moose are responding to that HTS approach, where lots of activity for a short amount of time takes place in a particular area, and then That area is closed off and regenerates, and then the next area is opened up for harvest. And how a reduction in linear features, as seismic lines and an access management plan become established on a landscape and less linear features are present, how that influences predator-prey dynamics.